So why get all worried about the peril of Jews in Israel? There's no real reason for us to be concerned. That was 2002. And yes, in America, we are lucky. But we are only lucky if we cut ourselves off from any fellow feeling for the not-so-lucky Jews who are right now under the gun, so to speak. Now, even more so in 2007. So, what a selfish definition of lucky that was. No, it is no longer taboo to speak of it, to think about a second Holocaust. And many of you, I wonder how many of you have read Israeli historian Benny Morris's recent essay in the Jerusalem Post called "The Next Holocaust Will Be Different." Have any of you read it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Very powerful, disturbing essay. Not all will agree with him, but it is no longer sacrilegious, let us say, to envision in detail a way it will happen, which is both terrible testimony to the state of things, yet in some ways, I think, a far more healthy response than what I came to think of as second Holocaust denial, the response of the literary editor of the New Republic and people like Tony Judt. But there is an aspect of the second Holocaust that is still unthinkable, or not very much thought about or written about, not taboo, at least in public, although you can be sure that in the inner councils of the IDF, they are thinking about it all the time. In part, this aspect is unthinkable because it's unbearable. Unbearable because it begins by envisioning that a second Holocaust has happened, that a nuclear device or some other chemical weapon of mass destruction, of some sort, has gone off in the midst of the Jewish state, and addresses the questions that the survivors in charge, in whatever bunkers remain, will have to face the day after a second Holocaust. And the day after that, one of those questions being the question of retaliation, its utility and justice. And this is where I'd be interested afterward, after I finish in hearing from you. Retaliation, is that justice or vengeance? Retaliation, how to decide who, where, how extensive. Retaliation even when the source of nuclear devastation is not known for sure. The result of a device smuggled in by a shadowy independent terrorist group that bought the bomb from Al-Qaeda, from the A.Q. Khan nuclear supermarket, from North Korea. Where to send the retaliatory nuclear missiles, or whether to retaliate at all. But before I present you with the dilemmas of the day after, let me talk about the evolution of the discourse on a second Holocaust, about the transition from taboo to mainstream, because I think there's a lesson to be learned from the controversy over it. My own thinking about this began while writing a book called Explaining Hitler, a cultural history and critique of Hitler explanation, one chapter of which was devoted to an account of a strange afternoon I spent interviewing David Irving, the world's leading Holocaust denier, in his posh London townhouse. A horrible experience, which reinforced my sense that Holocaust deniers were using their meretricious rhetoric as part of a strategy to lay the groundwork for a second Holocaust. Then in May 2002, I published a column in the New York Observer speculating for the first time about the possibility of a second Holocaust, one most likely resulting from nuclear exchange with Iran. The use of the term second Holocaust was in part provoked by my reading a passage in Philip Roth's novel, Operation Shylock. Any of you read that? It's an amazing book, and in it, a Rothian doppelganger who calls himself the Diasporus asserts, and I'm quoting now, the destruction of Israel in a nuclear exchange is a possibility much less far-fetched today than was the Holocaust itself 50 years ago, unquote. I found that shocking and a provocative thought. Is another Holocaust more or less likely than the last seemed to be before it happened? No one wanted to believe the world would let the first one happen. The world seems indifferent to the developing prospects of a second one. He goes on, Roth's Diasporus, to propose the resettlement of the Jews of Israel from what he characterizes as the target-like concentration camp Israel has become for those who would perpetrate the second Holocaust. It is, of course, not the only possible response Roth's diaspora resettlement plan. It is an extreme one, meant to provoke. Indeed, I found the phrase second Holocaust as a kind of Rorschach, which evokes from those who hear it their deepest feelings and fears about the entire Zionist enterprise and its relation to the diaspora. What is the real home? Is there any real home for the Jewish people in a world where anti-Semitism seems never to end, and where, in fact, it seems always to be exacerbated and escalating? I was surprised no one picked up on this Philip Roth passage in 1993 when the novel came out. But in 1993, there was a peace process. No one wanted to think it could fail. It was unthinkable it could fail. We were all subject to the American illusion that there is a solution to every problem if only people behave rationally. Alas, not everyone in the Middle East is known to behave rationally. I'm not convinced that the belief in the peace process was an entirely naive hope. Perhaps if Rabin had lived, maybe it would have made a difference. But here we are, and it's not a good place to be. Roth's second Holocaust fantasy raises the question of whether the identity of Jews should have been concentrated in or defined by Israel or on the Jews of the diaspora. While not accepting the diaspora's challenge to the wisdom of a Jewish state, back in 2002, I advocated taking the possibility of a second Holocaust seriously and began speculating about the aftermath. Oh, the outcry. I couldn't help thinking of a Bernard Malamud short story in which he has a parrot cry out, Gewalt, pogrom. Nothing I've written before or since has made people as irrationally angry just by mentioning those two words. Well, perhaps my attack on postmodern literary theory sophistry in my recent book, Shakespeare Wars, made a lot of people mad, but with all due respect, postmodern literary theory sophistry seeks only to deny the existence of literature, not to deny the existence of a land and a people. And in 2004, as Charles mentioned, I edited an anthology of essays by historians and scholars called Those Who Forget the Past. And in my introduction, I went a little more deeply into the circumstances that led to the controversy over the words Second Holocaust and some aspects of the aftermath. The context then was the Second Intifada, an incessant suicide bombing, but it wasn't the threat from Palestinian terror that led me to use the taboo phrase. It was reading Roth in the light of a chilling speech by Iranian Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, a man who is now described in the media as a moderate or a moderate conservative, as opposed to the real genocidal radicals, such as the current Iranian president. And yet, in his 2001 address, Rafsanjani said something more radical than Ahmadinejad's wipe Israel off the map. And by the way, a word on that, wipe Israel off the map. You know, it's been disputed. A lot of people have said it's been mistranslated. It's only meant as euphemistically, or it's only meant as a metaphor. It's meant as a wipe the political boundaries of Israel off the map and replace it with Tony Jute's binational state. I think we can probably all agree that wipe Israel off the map was, that we know what Ahmadinejad meant when he said it, however much those who don't wish to look carefully at things want to take it. But in any case, let us leave Ahmadinejad and Tony Jute and the binational state behind. For all we know, they are both sincere believers in a Panglossian kumbaya version of Jews and Palestinians living side by side. Instead, let us return to Hashemi Rafsanjani, who said something more explicit, more specific, non-metaphorical. He said that Iran would not shrink from a nuclear exchange with Israel because in such an exchange, it would take only one bomb to destroy Israel. One bomb, and these are Rafsanjani's words, it would be, quote, nothing left on the ground in Israel. Israel and the Jews therein would be destroyed, while Rafsanjani said Iran would suffer only, quote, damages, unquote, from an Israeli retaliation. Heavy damages. Millions dead, perhaps. But Israel would be gone forever, and there would be more than 1 billion Muslims left. Many of them, alas, who would welcome the death of the Jewish state, and even the Jews within it. Don't take my word for it. Read the translation of radical Islamic media, what they're saying in the mosques and Islamic media in the, most of you are probably familiar with the Middle East Media Research Institute and its translations of what's being actually said in the Arab world. It's chilling. But nothing left on the ground is one of the milder things. You could call it rhetorical, or who are we kidding? But what it did, in conjunction with the growing cult of suicide bombing martyrdom, was cast doubt on what the literary editor of the New Republic called Israel's magnificent deterrent, that is, its nuclear retaliatory arsenal. If a state or a terrorist group was willing to suffer the death or martyrdom of massive retaliation from Israel in order to destroy Israel, then Israel in effect no longer had a deterrent, or rather Israel would have to reconsider, reconfigure, or vastly expand its retaliatory threat, with still no guarantee that it would be sufficient. There was another factor which cast doubt on Israel's nuclear deterrent: non-state terrorism. Terrorism without a return address. A dirty nuclear bomb, chemical weapon, any kind of bomb smuggled into Israel by a non-state terrorist front group, content to die in the process. Who do you retaliate against in a case like that? Everyone? Anyone? What do you do? And so a second Holocaust cannot be deterred with the degree of confidence that Cold War deterrence offered America. Not that that was an extremely high confidence factor, and I think we escaped luckily with our lives. Deterring those who seek suicidal martyrdom is a far more difficult problem. The threat of death is no threat to those who want to die, who want to be martyrs. They are not the rational actors of Cold War nuclear theory. But nobody wanted to hear that when I wrote about it in April 2002. Now things have changed. The literary editor of the New Republic recently signed a statement explicitly warning, among other things, of the perils of, yes, he used the words, the statement used the words, a second Holocaust. Those precise 2 words. Was this a sudden attack of ethnic panic on his part, or a belated recognition of reality? Of course, his was not the only evasion of the question. At the time, I found the modes of evasion of second Holocaust denial, you might call it, to be interesting and instructive about Jewish willingness to face reality. There was what I came to call evasion by geographic displacement. Distinguished NYU professor Tony Judt, he of the brilliant plan for a binational state, for instance. Look how well binational state is working out in Iraq. When I appeared on a panel with Tony Judt on the Charlie Rose show to discuss the question, he misrepresented the problem by declaring fiercely that the thought of a second Holocaust in Europe was nonsense. For a scholar to engage in such shamefully disingenuous discourse is, alas, not uncommon, but particularly repellent coming from that quarter, since Professor Judt was soon to disclose his own plan for wiping Israel off the map, his binational state. And since he has subsequently called the state of Israel an anachronism. And then there was the not very bright New York Times columnist who was so confused or fearful, he wrote that I was talking about a second Holocaust in America. And then when I called him up to complain about this, he said, well, even if there were a Holocaust via nuclear weapon in Israel, it wouldn't really be a Holocaust, because a Holocaust involved rounding up people. And the nuclear weapon wouldn't, it would kill as many Jews, but it wouldn't have the rounding up. So this was his way of avoiding the question. It was as if these three grown men were so overwhelmed by a childish fear, dare I say panic, at facing the possibility, they had to deploy their own versions of denial, displace it to somewhere else, to Europe, to America, to cloud cuckoo land. They didn't have to fear it that way. This was second Holocaust denial. I was reminded of their willed blindness recently when a photograph appeared of the current Israeli defense minister gazing sagely into binoculars at the Lebanese border. Have you all seen that photo? Are you aware of this? Gazing through binoculars which had lens caps on them. I think a similar process, alas, has gone on with facing the reality of what the Jewish state is threatened with. I think it's time to remove the lens caps. It's not easier to stare into this particular possible future, across the border into that kind of horrid realm. It's not a pretty sight, but I wonder if we can afford not to look. Iran will soon have nuclear weapons. Pakistan already does, and Pakistan is probably one bullet away from becoming a nuclear-armed al-Qaeda state. North Korea will soon have them for sale. Loose nukes from the former Soviet Union are already on the market. Read the new edition of Graham Allison's Nuclear Terrorism. Read it and weep. Increasingly in mosques and media throughout the Middle East, thanks to the tireless translators of memory, we know that a certain strain of radical Islam preaches as a religious duty the extirpation of the Jewish state, and some, as in the Hamas Charter, the extermination of the Jews. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, 5 or 6 million Jews in Israel. What do you think the odds are that Israel will not be wiped off the map, pushed into the sea, however one expresses it, in the next half century? But you're not allowed to say that. Already, psychological terror is causing many in Israel to leave. And can you imagine living in a state where you and your children are constantly threatened, no longer not just by suicide bombs, but by, a repellent madman who constantly makes threats of nuclear terrorism. Alas, we are imprisoned by the American dogma of optimism. All problems must and will have a solution. But maybe this one won't. I think we have to face that possibility. Here's how Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, described it in a piece in the Jerusalem Post. And it was no coincidence, I think, that he published this piece shortly after the Iranian Holocaust Deniers conference. There's a connection between Holocaust deniers' rhetoric and the idea of a second Holocaust, which I will get to in a moment. But first, let's listen to Benny Morris. He said, "The second Holocaust will not be like the first. The Nazis, of course, industrialized mass murder, but still the perpetrators had one-on-one contact with the victims. They may have dehumanized them over months and years of appalling debasement before the actual killing, but still they were in eye-to-eye, eye-and-ear contact, sometimes in tactile contact with their victims. The second Holocaust," Benny Morris goes on to say, "will be quite different. One bright morning in 5 or 10 years, perhaps during a regional crisis, perhaps out of the blue, a day or a year or 5 years after Iran's acquisition of the bomb, the mullahs will convene in secret session under a portrait of the steely-eyed Ayatollah Khomeini and give President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad the go-ahead. The orders will go out, and the Shihab 3 and 4 missiles will take off for Tel Aviv, Beersheba, Haifa, and Jerusalem, and probably some military sites, including Israel's half-dozen air and reported nuclear missile bases. Some of the Shihabs will be nuclear tips, perhaps even with multiple warheads. Others will be dupes to draw attention away from anti-missile batteries. With a country the size and shape of Israel, probably 4 or 5 hits will suffice. No more. No more Israel. 1 million or more Israelis in the greater Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem areas will die immediately. Millions will be seriously irradiated. No Iranian will see or touch an Israeli. It will be quite impersonal." So saith Benny Morris, not me. You can read it online on the Jerusalem Post website. What surprises is that we are so far beyond taboo. We are now to the point of assigning a philosophical hierarchy of Holocaust possibilities, personal and impersonal. Is one more authentic, to use the language of modernism? To Benny Morris, Hitler's Holocaust was both vicious and personal, face to face. The next one, or the one he envisions, the one he chooses to assign only to Iran rather than, say, Al-Qaeda or some as yet unknown splinter terror group, on the other hand, quote, will be quite impersonal, he concludes. In other words, it will be much easier to accomplish, all the more likely to occur. The banality of impersonality, you might say. As I say, it was no accident that Morris published this in the aftermath of the Tehran Holocaust Deniers conference. It crystallized the way the rhetorical strategy of Holocaust denial had been enlisted in laying the groundwork for a second Holocaust. It's a scenario I began thinking about after the Iranian Holocaust Deniers conference demonstrated the link between denial of the first and preparation for the second. A word about the evolution of the rhetoric of Holocaust denial. As someone who studied it with fascination ever since that encounter with David Irving and a subsequent discussion with the philosopher Beryl Lang on whether Holocaust denial is a new step in the evolution of the history of evil. Lang said no, he thought Heidegger's Holocaust indifference was worse. After all, most Holocaust deniers know it happened and are glad it did, but their public stance is that it would be wrong. They wish to exculpate Hitler from such, what they say in public anyway, is a crime, however much they long for it. Heidegger, however, felt nothing, said nothing. Heidegger had something to say about everything in the world, but somehow this escaped his notice while he was a Nazi party official, purging non-party members and undergoing denazification with the help of Hannah Arendt. Read Beryl Lang's book on Heidegger and the Holocaust for a study of Holocaust indifference. As far as Holocaust denial, I'm sure you know that it began with a certain far leftist sect in France centered around a bookstore called the Old Mole. At first, it seemed to me it was divided between those who knew it happened and were just using denial to twist a knife and because they hated Jews, and those who were genuinely deluded. Recently, though, Holocaust denial has undergone a number of variations. There's Holocaust minimization, in which they spend their time diligently trying to reduce the number of Jews killed and claim that some millions were killed by typhus epidemics and the like, and only a few literally murdered. And then there's the Holocaust exploitation allegation. This is the Norman Finkelstein position. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He regards that any memory of the Holocaust as being meretriciously used by Zionists to support the existence of the Jewish state. There's no really good reason to remember it. Finally, well, semi-finally, there's something I've come to call, I think most insidiously, Holocaust inconsequentiality. It's my phrase for the kind of Holocaust denial deployed by sophisticated people, not drooling anti-Semites, usually, I think, unwitting of how historically opaque they're being. Holocaust inconsequentialism is insidious because, well, I'll give you an illustration. Was a writer in the New York Times magazine who scolded posthumously Menachem Begin for something he said about the Holocaust in the aftermath of the Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the early 80s. The attack that perhaps put off a second Holocaust for a few decades. The writer scolded Begin because in describing his reasons for the Iraq mission, Begin said he thought of the 1.5 million children who died in the Holocaust. No, and he just wasn't going to allow that to happen again. No, the writer in the Times magazine scolded Begin, you shouldn't have mentioned the Holocaust or those children. It was unnecessary. It was inflammatory. Just because one dictator declared he wanted to commit mass murder and went ahead and did it, one shouldn't learn any lesson from it. One shouldn't be influenced by it. One shouldn't even speak of it when dealing with another potential mass murderer's genocidal capability. Now, one can depend too much on history for lessons, but to learn nothing from the Holocaust, to not mention it in, or consider it in deciding one's contemporary policy, to not allow it to have any influence, it sacralizes it somehow, separates and removes it from history entirely. Holocaust inconsequentialism says, yes, it happened, it just shouldn't matter to us now. The past shouldn't affect how we act in the present and future. No consequences to the Holocaust. It's a kind of denial. But, and here is the juncture between the rhetoric of Holocaust denial and the prospect of a second Holocaust that I laboriously insinuated into the title of my talk, the rhetoric of rhetorical strategies of Holocaust denial and the prospect of a second Holocaust. Holocaust denial has now got a focus. It's become a way of delegitimizing the state of Israel and legitimizing its destruction. The Tehran Holocaust Conference revealed this nakedly. It illustrated how the various strains of Holocaust denial have merged into a single-minded purpose, to make it seem that the Jewish state was founded on a lie, that the Holocaust was fabricated to guilt-trip the West into giving the Jews lands that, of course, they never lived on before, belonged to the Arabs, perpetrated the idea that the only reason the Jewish state came into being was essentially a Jewish trick, the fake Holocaust. And therefore, the undoing of the Jewish state would be, in itself, no tragedy, but rather, perhaps, even some kind of justice. Now, I don't need to tell you how fraudulent this rhetoric is, but the point is that Holocaust denial now has a focused target. It's not just a way of twisting the knives and allowing anti-Semites to make Jews suffer once again. It has a deliberate purpose, and that's why it was no coincidence that it was held in Tehran and now has the enabling empowerment of a powerful, soon-to-be nuclear state. But why its persistence, Holocaust denial, and its appeal? I think it has a subtle dog whistle appeal to the ears of European culture, a culture that still labors under the burden of shame for its complicity with Hitler. Glorious European civilization nonetheless gave birth to a Holocaust in the most educated, civilized state it had produced in Germany, and enlisted the voluntary aid of every single nation in Europe, except perhaps Portugal. When I wrote recently about the emblematic attack of a Holocaust denier on Elie Wiesel, the emblematic Holocaust survivor. Are you familiar with that? You probably read about it, but it seemed to me it received very little coverage. But nonetheless, it suggested to me, it symbolized the way Holocaust survivors are an unwanted reminder of a past the West would like to deny, even if they, most of them anyway, know that they can. When I spoke to George Steiner on this question, he said that the Hitler's Holocaust removed the safety net. What he meant was the safety net beneath which our appraisal of the depths of human nature, a stopping point. After the Holocaust, there was no safety net. There was no bottom to the depths of human nature that it revealed. We don't want to, or people in the West don't want to acknowledge this. And I think you can see this in the half-hearted efforts of the world community to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which they constantly are threatening the state of Israel with. So these half-hearted efforts, I think, may have a darker side than mere ineptness and weakness. But let me turn now to what I think will be the most controversial aspect of my talk, and the one that I'd be interested in hearing your reaction to. Question of the day after. What if the haters and the Holocaust deniers and the Hashemi Rafsanjanis and the Ahmadinejads and the Al-Qaeda people get their way? What if it happens the way Benny Morris describes it? Then the answer, I suppose, so some might want to dispute me, and I'd like to hear your voices if so, the question is relatively easy. Nuclear retaliation against Iran. Or is it easy? Even in the Cold War, some suggested once a deterrent fails, there's no point in using it for retaliation. In other words, if we can't prevent a first strike, what is the point of killing tens of, perhaps hundreds of millions of civilians out of revenge, retaliation, justice, what do you call it? I don't know the answer to this. But I do know, I spoke to a reporter I know who spends a lot of time talking to Israeli defense and intelligence officials, the people who will be in charge of the question of retaliation. He told me there's no doubt, at least among those in charge of retaliation, that if deterrence fails, there will be retaliation. Question is, will it be limited? Will it become, or will it become known as, become what is known as the Samson option, bringing the entire Middle East, perhaps setting the entire world aflame? He also suggested there was no way a surprise attack could destroy Israel's deterrent power. He gave me the example of the way the Isaiah scroll in the shrine of the book was protected, well, initially anyway. It was put in a kind of well that was designed in a case of emergency to retract far beneath the ground in a hardened site protected by yards of layers of armored steel plates strong enough to withstand a nuclear blast. If they're going to do that for the Isaiah scroll, he says, they'll do that for their nuclear retaliatory rockets. And then there are the 3 Dolphin 800 class submarines, which the Israelis bought from the Germans, yes, the Germans, in the late 90s, which are now or will soon be equipped with nuclear weapons, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And submarines are the deterrent of last resort because there is no way of reliably finding and destroying them in a first strike. But what if a second Holocaust is not the result of a nation-state attack, but of a smuggled-in nuke by some shadowy terrorist group? Then who or what is there to retaliate against? Would retaliation in itself, the death of tens or more, hundreds of millions of civilians, who knows, perhaps be justified if the deterrent purpose of the, would it be justified if the retaliatory, the deterrent purpose of the retaliatory weapons have failed? This was, again, during the Cold War, much debated. I spent a lot of time studying Cold War nuclear mutual assured deterrent theory, and in nuclear strategic circles, there was always the worry that once a first strike occurred, a president would decide that, well, there's no point in killing tens of millions of civilians. Retaliatory weapons are not pinpoint weapons. They're necessarily city-destroying weapons. It's a terrible choice. Would anything be gained by Israeli massive retaliation? Would it be done to prevent a third Holocaust? Would it be done so that a second Jewish state could be protected? Should there be an attempt to create another Jewish state, or would a second Holocaust be the final argument, in a way, against concentrating Jews in one place? God forbid any of this should happen. But, alas, it could. And yet one senses a new taboo, against speaking about this. I sensed this when I asked 3 scholars at the Jewish Theological Seminary to address this question before I came here to speak to you about it. I wanted to draw upon their wisdom. They were steeped in Jewish lore on revenge, retaliation, justice, the fine differences between them, etc., etc. I asked them by email, what if they were commanders of one of the Israeli retaliatory submarines with the power that submarines have because of the difficulties of post-war underseas communication to decide whether to launch or not to launch retaliation. Would they use their weapons in the event of a second Holocaust? What did Jewish wisdom and morality say? I've been directed to them by someone who said they were experts on the Jewish literature and commentary on questions of revenge and retaliation. You might recognize their names. I promise not to use them. But none of them wanted to touch the question. One of them actually wrote to me in an email that in asking this question, I was actually asking something that was indeed something new under the sun. Now, those were his words. Something new under the sun. In other words, he was saying nothing in the Jewish past, nothing in Jewish wisdom could cast light on such a horrible decision. Something new under the sun. That's why I was gratified by the invitation to this seminar, so I could ask you about this question, about the day after, about this something new under the sun, about the question of retaliation. I feel it has to be discussed. I mean, I hate to ruin your day by asking you to. I hate to discuss this subject at all, but it seems to me that there's a lack of discussion, that the lens caps are on the binoculars. And so I will be grateful to hear whatever you have to say about this, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much. Does anybody ask questions?
Yeah.
No. Okay, go ahead. And I'll, if you signal to me, I'll keep on this.
Thank you for making my day. But you left out something very different, very complex, and that is, instead of retaliation, revenge, the question of preemption, which others have brought up.
It's a very good question, and one thing I didn't want to do is to make this talk an argument for preemption, because I think it's inevitably going to be catastrophic for both sides. I don't think it's an answer. It may put off perhaps Iranian nuclear development for some years, but it may accelerate the desire for other non-state terrorists to use nuclear weapons on Israel. I'm not sure what the calculus is, but I feel that maybe I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. But I just feel that obviously, if there's a warning that in 24 hours, Iran is going to launch nuclear weapons. Okay, preempt. But do you preempt now? Do you preempt when they know they have nuclear weapons? Do you stop it? Do you cause hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of casualties by doing so? I don't know. I mean, you've asked a really important question, and I wish I had a good answer for it. I just resisted.
I wish you had one too.
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and this is sort of taking a small section of what you outlined, that some weapons can be smuggled into Israel. The type of weapons that could be smuggled in, could it really create a Holocaust, or could it really wipe out huge amounts of the population, or could it just in quotations, is just a crazy question in a way, but could it just cause, say, massive damage, but not a Holocaust as such?
Well, I think there are a range of things that such weapons can do. You read Graham Allison's Nuclear Terrorism. Yes, a small dirty bomb would only cause tens of thousands of deaths. These bombs are not huge. several could be brought in from several different directions at the same time, and the attack coordinated. I don't think that, well, I think, yes, it's possible that there will be only a small-scale attack. It's also possible that the attack will be larger. You can't rule that out. I mean, that's not somehow comforting, to me anyway, the idea that, well, maybe it'll only be a small nuke, because if a small nuke can be smuggled in, several small nukes can be smuggled in, or one or two large ones.
You didn't mention prevention. The only slightly optimistic thing you said was 10 years ago things looked like they could work if Rabin had lived. And so let's pursue that for a moment. What is your scenario for another
Well,
Rabin emerging?
look
There's
at
not
the
one there now, I know.
Yeah, look at the facts on the ground. I mean, you've read the Hamas charter, right? You have. And you've read the words that call for the extermination of the Jews. And you know that Hamas is a ruling majority in Palestine. So you have a peace process with people who say they want to exterminate the Jews. Will they change their minds if you give them some territory? I just wish, you know, that I could believe that some peace process would result in this. But I think even if you had your ultimate ideal peace process, I mean, you know, even during the Rabin-Arafat peace process, the Palestinians were saying in Arabic that this was just the first stage of driving the Jews into the sea. I don't think anyone now would say that Arafat was an idealist who really wanted to stop at the Green Line. So, you know, I would love to believe that a peace process would prevent it, but, you know, there are terrorist groups who, no matter what document is signed by what entity of the Palestinians, who will see that as a betrayal by the Palestinians, and will be have even more incentive to destroy Israel, because they will feel that the Palestinians have betrayed the cause, and in fact, you know, by making a peace with the Jews, you know, deserve to die with them. It's alas, if you read the rhetoric of a certain strain of radical Islamists and terror group leaders, this is what they say to their people. So, you know, I wish I could be comforted by the idea that a peace process would work, but, you know, the Palestinians elected Hamas. They know it was in the charter.
Just as a footnote, this as a coincidence, our newsletter tomorrow will come out, and we're printing the Hamas charter for those of you should read it.
Yeah, I have the two main comments about the talk. Preemptive attack doesn't have to be nuclear attack.
True.
And we learned lately that there are weapons that can penetrate, you know, big bunkers and you know, such facilities. So I don't really think that Israel should look at it as only the, you know, the doomsday, you know. It can also be a military, well calculated event. But
Let me address that before you said you have 2 points. That was the first one. I think that the Israeli attack might not be nuclear, but it will be an attack on nuclear facilities. And when you blow up nuclear facilities, it's very likely that you spread nuclear radiation for enough to irradiate and kill X number of people, a large number of people. And, you know, I guess maybe that's the best possible solution, military solution, but I'm not sure that it's going to be something that is going to be a lasting solution, because Pakistan already has the bomb, you know. Musharraf is hanging on by his fingernails, you know. Pakistani intelligence, ISI, is basically Al-Qaeda. where Sharif goes, Al-Qaeda has nuclear weapons. So what are you going to do? Then preemptively attack Pakistan? So anyway, you had a second point?
True, and then my other comment actually supports your horrific scenario, because for many years people had that opinion that the fact that there are holy sites for Muslims in Israel is in a way some kind of an insurance policy.
Yes.
But lately in the Iraq war, you actually saw that these like holy sites, whatever, it's a very ancient mosque and very, famous mosque. It doesn't really stop anyone.
It's a good point, and I always, for a long time, I too sort of hung on to that as an insurance policy. But talking to reporters who have spent a lot of time on the ground in Israel and talking with Israeli defense officials, and in a way, what they say is that Al-Qaeda doesn't care about the Palestinians. Al-Qaeda thinks the Palestinians betrayed the Islamic cause by entering into negotiations with the Jews anyway. One terror scenario would be for some terror group to say, we have a bomb in Tel Aviv, you Israeli Arabs have 2 weeks to leave the country. What's going to happen then? And maybe it's a bluff, maybe it's real.
I don't think they even care about it.
I tend to agree. It's hard to believe, but it's maybe even more pessimistic than me.
Realistic.
Michael? Professor Katz?
Yes. About your question of the day after scenario, you seem to be looking at it in terms of response to the action that has occurred. And I would suggest that you could also look at it in terms of response to prevent additional actions. So in two ways. One is with regards to the Jews around the world, because I don't know if it's really known who blew up the Jewish center in a community center in Buenos Aires, if it was Hezbollah, if it was Iran.
Right.
But I've read some of the writings of Khomeini, which were clearly anti-Semitic, so that if there's a hatred of Jews in the Iranian leadership, it wouldn't stop with Israel. So that's one point about the usefulness of retaliation to prevent a similar kind of attack on Jews throughout the world. Plus, it's not just about Jews. That a nation that would take action to wipe out another nation is probably a nation, or the leadership of that nation, that would attack and wipe out other nations, whether it's Sunni enemies, or if Israel is the little Satan, then the United States is the great Satan. So I think you should look at that day after scenario in terms of what it would mean for the future of Jews around the world and other nations around the world if Iran were to, in effect, get away with it.
So you would be in favor of retaliation against Iran, and I could see your argument. My dark side says that it's, there's a terrible kind of blame the victim thing that goes on with Jews, and somehow Jews would be blamed, what I mean, for even after this. But I see your point. What would you say about a non-state terror attack? Then, who would we retaliate against in that case?
The intelligence often kind of eventually leaks out about who is behind these things. So I don't know that a retaliation would have to occur immediately, but if it did eventually come out, that it could be traced back to a particular player.
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Retaliation does not have to be immediate. It is something that could be held over the heads of the world, or one thinks that Israeli intelligence or in some way has communicated to the Arab capitals that it doesn't matter to us whether it's non-state. If you permit a nuclear attack on Israel, by non-state, we will assume it came from you. I mean, that's perhaps one way of bolstering deterrence, but I think you make an interesting point.
Yeah, I have a question about your assumption that Rafsanjani is one of the mullahs who has an ironclad control over the society in Iran. I was a dean in Iran for 4 years in the late 70s, just before Khomeini arrived. And so I was familiar in a marginal way with false mullahs, illiterate mullahs, as opposed to well-educated mullahs. And so my question is, when you say a round table of mullahs can make the decision to go ahead and strike...
That was Benny Morris. I was quoting.
Okay. But what is your feeling about that option?
You know, my feeling is that if the survival of Israel depends on our hope that the nice mullahs will prevail over the not-so-nice mullahs, it's not a very powerful confidence-building feeling that, in fact, I think the development of suicide martyrdom, the ideology of suicide martyrdom, does change deterrence. Even if Rafsanjani is not ruling right now, the statement he made calls into question the certainty of deterrence, because in effect it says there are at least some people in Iran who would be willing to sacrifice X number of people in Iran to destroy Israel on behalf of the Muslim world. They would be martyrs, they would go to heaven, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're absolutely right that, you know, Rafsanjani is not the only mullah, and that the people who think like him are not the only ones who are in charge. But certainly a significant faction thinks that way. And if I were the IDF, I think we should take that into account in terms of their certainty that mere possession by Israel of nuclear weapons is going to deter another nuclear-armed state.
Yes, I look around the room, and I'd like you to comment. What do you think of the fact that the average age in this room is at least 65?
Oh, you all look very young to me. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think that the Jews, the bulk of the Jews in this community don't care about this problem. They're not here.
It's a chilling statement. Everyone think that's true? I mean, look, yeah, I guess if you're younger,
Spring break next week.
Yeah. I guess if you're younger.
So what do you think about it?
I suppose I think there is a kind of will blindness to this. You know, we're the luckiest Jews in history. Says the editor of the New Republic, the literary editor of the New Republic. And if one is happily raising a family in America, it's a bummer having to think of those Jews in Israel and their plight. We're doing fine. I'm all right, Jack. All that kind of thing. And so I think you make a good point that perhaps it's not something that there is a kind of denial going on.
Since I would assume most of the world assumes the certainty of an Israeli counterstrike, would not a discussion of the desirability of a day after counterstrike actually reduce deterrence?
It's a very good point. This was, a point that was raised during the Cold War when people questioned mutually assured destruction. And the answer then was, well, maybe it should be more hardwired into it, a Strangelove situation where, it didn't depend on a hesitant, trembling finger to press the button, and therefore deterrence would have more credibility. But then you're subject to accident, mistaken signals, et cetera, and could destroy the world by mistake. But I agree that that is it's a factor that's worth considering. On the other hand, to not it's funny. When I brought this up with my friend, the reporter, was like, he's in and out of Mossad offices all the time. He said, don't worry, no one's they're going to retaliate. You can discuss it all you want. They're going to do it. They're going to take. They've decided we're not going to go quiet at this time. And it's a sort of fundamental principle of their worldview. So I don't know.
But the desire to use a Yiddish phrase, beschreini, may not stem from a lack of desire to look at the facts, but from a hard reality of, an appreciation of the realities of the situation.
In other words, you're saying, don't discuss the question of retaliation because it will undermine. Yeah. I thought of that, and as I said, I put it to my friend. He said, "Don't worry about that. You're not going to undermine it." So I'm not sure what to say in response to that. I feel like intellectually, I hate to be held responsible for undermining Israeli deterrence. I don't think I will, but that's why I wanted to talk to these people at the Jewish Theological Seminary and find out, what they thought about killing tens of millions of innocent civilians.
Yeah, irrespective of what might happen the day after, since it hasn't happened, the official position and the semi-official position and any rumored position has got to be there will be retaliation.
Right.
From a game theory point of view.
Right.
And so, so we don't know what they're going to do, but we can be pretty sure that they're going to say they're going to retaliate. I would think.
That's right. Yeah. So then we shouldn't discuss it.
No, I think it's fine. I think we can even go one step further. If they're going to talk about retaliation, because it's necessary, they perhaps want to fine-tune it a little bit more.
Say that again.
They want to fine-tune it a little bit more on perhaps not all the details, but that this retaliation, following that same trend, would have to be fairly specific.
Right, and I think that's why I think the Rosenbaum statement is important in game theory terms, in that it requires a certain maybe escalation of the retaliatory threat, maybe to include. I mean, I've seen this, and believe me, I don't want to be seen as someone who's advocating this, but I've seen the destruction of Muslim holy places as one additional, not just tit for tat strike back at Tehran, but strike back at places that are dear to them and would make them perhaps think twice. I don't know if that will be efficacious or not.
And there seems to be a consensus that the sort of biggest winner of the war in Iraq has been Iran, and that the war has strengthened the worst elements of the mullahs in Iran, in part because it allows them to play more of a nationalist role than the other parties would have. And without this, there may have been more of a debate in Iran about how pro-Western or anti-Western to be. And first, I'm curious, do you share that view? And second, what does that say to you about the impact of the war in Iraq on the security of Israel?
Well, to the first question, I'm not as well versed in Iranian politics and its fine-grained detail to know which faction has been strengthened. I would say, in some ways, Iran as a whole has certainly been strengthened. Whether it might perhaps work the other way, in the sense that they feel that they're doing so well without using nuclear weapons, that let's just proceed along this course and eventually we'll push the Israelis into the sea without having to risk nuclear retaliation. So that's a possibility. What was the second part of your question? Whether the security of Israel is, yeah, well, I don't see how it's been enhanced. Certainly Hezbollah's been strengthened by when Iran is strengthened, Hamas has been strengthened when Iran is strengthened. I don't see many signs for optimism in that point.
Do you see, or perhaps better, how do you see the state of Israel as part of the redemption of the Jewish people?
It's interesting. It's a really good question, and I grew up a non-observant Jew. People ask me about this. I say, well, my parents weren't observant, so I'm honoring my father and mother. It's an easy way out, I know. But and I was not, a Zionist particularly. It seemed to me that I didn't consider closely these questions until the end of the peace process, I think. I spent 10 years writing a study of the historiography of Hitler, so it's certainly sensitive to Holocaust questions and the need for a safe haven for Jews, but it also, rereading Roth's Operation Shylock in the light of the Second Intifada and the end of the peace process made me question again whether or not concentrating Jews in one spot was not the best idea for the redemption of the Jews, or the saving of the Jews, but made it easier for the enemies of the Jews to finish the job. I hate to say that. I don't want to believe it. I want to believe that the state of Israel will survive and thrive, et cetera, et cetera. I think that I've grown. I've felt a stronger affinity for it. I think the more in peril it gets, because I feel that these people are part of my extended family, and I honor them as my father and mother too. So I feel close to them, and I feel their peril. So your question was,
yeah, as part of there is a sense of the state of Israel as part of the seeds of Jewish redemption.
Yeah.
Theologically, there's also a sense of the state of Israel that Jewish power beats Jewish weakness. And those two elements sort of dovetail, and obviously, if the state of Israel ultimately leads to the destruction of the Jews, what does that say about all sorts of normative Jewish theology and Jewish understanding?
Yeah, in some ways, I don't think it necessarily says anything bad about Jewish theology, about Zionism, about anything. I think it says something bad about the whole human race, and the fact that it tolerates anti-Semitism. It stood by while the Holocaust took place. It's not doing much to prevent a second Holocaust, and so I think the Jews are doing the best they can, and Jewish power and Jewish redemption in Israel, in some ways are beautiful. But there's a downside to it that we're seeing as well, and so I just don't know how to judge it. I wish I did.
The question raised by the gentleman over here about the age in the room, I think it leads to something though. So many of us growing up encountered some kind of anti-Semitism, whether it was on the streets, trying to get into schools, get jobs, etc. Along the way, the death camps opened, and we found out how dramatic that could be. So we have lived lives that at best we're very wary about others and their intentions and feelings towards us. Fortunately, the next generation in America has grown up, of Jews I'm talking about, grown up with much less anti-Semitism and maybe not experiencing it at all.
Yes.
And so some of them would look at this meeting and say, either we're a bunch of old fuddy-duddies frightened of our shadows, or saying it's beyond belief and we refuse to believe it. I think it takes, and this is why I'm bringing this up, I think you've got to, that we all have to support educational programs both within our own community as well as with the whole American community and outside American community, that it happened and it can happen again. And just saying never again is not going to stop it from happening.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because, I grew up, not experiencing really almost any anti-Semitism. And the lead essay in the anthology I edited, Those Who Forget the Past, was by Jonathan Rosen, and appeared first in the New York Times Magazine. His father was a Holocaust survivor, one of the Kindertransport people from Vienna. And he talked about growing up in living this great American life, and then suddenly after September 11th, and reading about how half the world believed that the Jews caused 9/11, et cetera, and and the way he felt like, oh no, I don't want to have to live my father's life, but in fact, if you look clearly at the situation, maybe things haven't changed as much. If you look just at America, things are fine. There's not a lot of anti-Semitism. The Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, not a big factor. But that's an irresponsible, and blind way to look at the world. And so, it's not a pleasant thing for me, for Jonathan, for those of us who grew up not experiencing anti-Semitism or the cognizant during the death camps, whatever, to have to feel this way. But I think it's, if you're living any kind of authentic life, you have to.
I think the Jews are so old as an identity, really the oldest thing on earth, maybe with China and the Hindus. And I think that in the way that there was no, to use a terrible euphemism, there was no real final solution. In the same way, there'll be no final redemption, and that history will go on, and the Jews will be here long after the United States, I think. It's speculative, but now if this is really something new under the sun, what would you do in the day after? It's a chance to maybe redefine it and say, well, we take our nukes and we renounce them, and we set a new moral identity, and we, in 5,000 years, will be remembered for doing that.
Well, I respect you for the courage to say that, I think a lot of people would not want to sacrifice their children to the possibility of being remembered 5,000 years from now. And someone said that, it's the Christians who say turn the other cheek, but it's the Jews who really have turned the other cheek. So, I'm glad you brought this up, because it is a possibility, to renounce retaliation. It's a kind of alien to me, I'm at a moment where I just really don't know what the right thing to do is.
It's absurd, I know.
Just going back to the Middle East, a crazy place where people don't have, such a clean logic. And the history is quite bloody. Regarding nuclear weapons, Israel has a vague policy, as you might know, and many people here are aware of it. In other words, we have a nuclear reactor, but we never said that we have nuclear ability. And, you know, playing both sides.
And the question is?
And the question is, at the moment, there are many nations in the area, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, that are trying to get their hands on nuclear ability, nuclear weapons, either by buying it or making it by themselves. Saudi lately seems like they're trying to get it.
Got it, but the question is?
Is it not the right time maybe that Israel should change its policy, you know, and maybe this will put things in different order?
Good question, and in fact, you know, there are indications that Israel is changing its policy. You know, the Olmert's famous slip of the tongue at the time of the Iranian Holocaust Deniers conference, in which you know, Israel has this, I think the official name of the policy is nuclear ambiguity, but Olmert said, you know, Iran shouldn't get nuclear weapons because Iran is an insane state, while the countries that have nuclear weapons like France, Russia, Israel, the US are sane countries, essentially. And then there was a big fuss because it seemed like he was admitting that Israel had nuclear weapons, and the question was this deliberate? And I think it was, actually. I think it was his way of saying to Iran, you know, stop. You know, if you want to threaten us with nuclear weapons, let's just drop the charade, or anyway, drop one curtain of ambiguity. And make it clear. I think he was speaking not to the Iranian leadership, but to the Iranian people, and saying, your leadership is putting you at risk of nuclear attack by Israel. And so, you know, I mean, I think it was an important development.
Just final two questions. First one.
I would like to introduce Europe into this scenario, and I would wanted to respond to you saying that Europe was a continent of highly educated people. I take issue with that, because to me education includes ethics, and I think Europeans were educated in the sense that they educated classes in Latin and Greek, but I don't think they really were educated in an ethical sense, and as far as Germany is concerned, I think they were highly trained.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I couldn't disagree with you. I mean, I was taking, you know, okay, civilization in quotes.
Right. Yeah, I would like to add that nothing much has changed. That in Germany right now, the perception of Israel is negative in 77% of the population. 20% have a negative perception of all Jews worldwide, and that Germany also is the largest trading partner of Iran, including military hardware.
I couldn't disagree with you.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in your book and talked about but haven't really talked about is the role.
Speak louder, I'm sorry.
One of the things that you talked about in the book but haven't really talked about is the role of the Western media, and I wondered, you know.
Yes, I did. I think, alas, the Western media has played a shameful role in the process of delegitimizing the state of Israel through propagating lies like the so-called massacre at Jenin, where words like Auschwitz, comparisons of Israelis to Nazis were thrown around, mass murder when this was totally untrue, proven to be untrue, and yet you still see references to that, and the moral equivalence between, it's shocking sometimes when you will see, I mean, I know a writer I know is Jewish, you know, I mean, I'm a liberal, he's a liberal, you know, I see him write how the number of civilians killed by Israelis equals or is greater than the number of civilians killed by Palestinians. It's as if the Israelis go out hunting and seeking to kill innocent civilians, when the Palestinians actually do that with suicide bombs. They blow them up in cafes and where families are celebrating Passover, et cetera, et cetera. Civilians, Palestinian civilians killed by Israelis are not killed deliberately because they are Palestinians. There are Palestinians killed, but often because they're sheltering terrorists, they're in the way of attempts to dislodge terrorists, and the IDF uses every means, including self-destructive means, to avoid doing that. And yet, the media reports it as if it were the same thing. It's quite maddening.
So we're going to end here, but I just wanted to thank you. But I want to say I think it's a very sober seminar that you presented us with. But I think it's, whether we agree or disagree, I think you raised issues that we need to think about very clearly. And even though we may not be experts on nuclear deterrence and the nuclear threat, I think these are things that we should explore in the face of a very tangible genocidal anti-Semitism, which is, I argue, and stuff I'm doing, a social movement that's very serious and very real. I think that we really need to begin to educate ourselves on what's happening in certain parts of the world. In our newsletter, Hamas Covenant will be featured, and I think we need to really begin to read about and become aware of what's going on. And I think we need to be the first to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.